Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I appreciate you guys getting ready to follow along here for our first Explain Everything lesson. Although I'm not there physically in class today, this is a great opportunity for us to keep up with the notes as we continue to talk about Christopher Columbus. And as we said yesterday, certainly quite an important figure to speak about in regards to his impact, not just on the age of exploration, but the actuality of American history, even though he didn't step foot in America, but also world history because he sets into action um, a major push towards exploration westward of Europe. And as we introduced yesterday, it's his legacy that is one that's at times difficult to talk about, and a lot of times we get the comparison of him being considered a hero, but also at the same time a villain. So we're going to dive into that not just in today's lesson, but more so tomorrow when I'm back in class on Wednesday to actually have a full debate about that. All right, so yesterday we talked about Christopher Columbus as more of an introductory point of view in regards to who Christopher Columbus was. Yesterday we said that technically he's born in what we would consider to be Italy today, but one of the myths that we went over yesterday was that he was actually born in Genoa, all right, which at the time was an independent state around 1451. Many historians classify Columbus as an Italian-born explorer, but the fact of the matter was Italy wasn't even a country back in 1451, so it isn't until centuries later when Italy is actually one of the many countries in Europe, but at the time Genoa was an independent state, so we'll just leave it at that. And from an early age, as we said yesterday, Columbus had an interest in boats and in sea travel. And because of that, after his ship on a merchant ship was shipwrecked right off the coast of Portugal, he lived much of his late teenage and early adult life there, where he looked to study to become his own captain, to have his own fleet, and most importantly, to explore. Now, the big thing for Christopher Columbus is that he wanted fame. He wanted to be considered one of the best sea captains in all of the world. And he led many expeditions around the area of Europe. He is noted from sailing from Ireland even to South Africa. He explored all different parts of the Atlantic. But it's really in 1485 that he has this idea, which was very different than the time period. Many explorers who were studying in Sagres, Portugal, had come to the fact that the quickest trade route to Asia was by sailing south along the west coast of Africa and then making their way onto the Middle East or Asia. But Columbus had a different point of view. Columbus thought that the world, you remember we said yesterday, he did not prove the world was flat, but at that he understood the world was a sphere, but the question at this time in the 1480s was, well, how big was the Earth? And according to Columbus's calculations, he thought the Earth was a lot smaller than people had suspected. And he believed that the quickest trade route to Asia was not by sailing south, but rather by sailing west. And that direction right there is going to make all the difference when we talk about Columbus in comparison to other explorers. Now, what Christopher Columbus believed is that a voyage of this magnitude would take approximately 6 weeks. All right, looking at calendars, looking at maps, he figured that the best course of action, according to him, would be sailing west and would take about 6 weeks, 2,500 miles or so. And he brings this proposal to a number of different countries. And being that he was living in Portugal at the time in 1485, he goes to King John II, who happens to be Prince Henry the Navigator's dad, and he comes up with this great idea, and he says, listen, I'd like to sail west, I'd like to bring prestige to Portugal. And King John says, that's a nice idea in theory, but we're not going to waste our money. All of our concentration as a country is not believing that to be the truth, but rather sailing south along the west coast of Africa in order to get to Asia. So Columbus is certainly upset, but he is persistent. And his persistence actually brings him back to Genoa, an independent state at its time, and they too are going to decline Columbus of this idea in financing a voyage. Columbus even reaches out to England, King Henry King Henry rather the seventh at the time, and he gives the same spiel that he has this idea of sailing west and he wants to bring pride and prestige and glory to England, and he wants to do this. And King Henry the Seventh says, "Yeah, we're not really into exploration right now. We're not willing to finance this." So that's when Columbus finally stumbles upon Spain. And King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, who were king and queen of Spain at the time, they hear Columbus out in this grand plan, and they actually tell him no at first. And then they reconvene. And it's during the late 1480s that King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella reconvene, and they have this idea, and they say to themselves, "Listen, we're rivals with Portugal at this time. This is an opportunity for us to establish a quicker trade route. Worst comes to worst, this guy Columbus doesn't return with any good news. But best case scenario, what if he's right? Maybe this is worth putting some money in." So it takes a few years of negotiating the terms, but Ferdinand and Isabella are going to be the monarchs, the king and queen, that will wind up agreeing to finance a voyage westward for Columbus. So obviously you can imagine for Columbus, this idea of becoming famous is more of a reality now that King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella have agreed to finance this voyage. So as you can imagine, Christopher Columbus would be ecstatic at the idea that finally a monarch is willing to finance his voyage, and he still truly believes that he is going to establish the quickest trade route to Asia. But King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella aren't willing to put all their eggs in one basket, so to speak, considering that this was a tremendous risk for Spain in financing a voyage like this, since no one has tried or has successfully attempted this in the world so far. They are only going to give Columbus a fleet of 3 ships, and then famously the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. The Santa Maria being the flagship of the 3, which Columbus will wind up captaining. And they only give him just about less than 100 men, all right, to work on these 3 ships. So this isn't a huge financial investment for Spain at this time, but instead it's certainly an opportunity. Now, remember what I said on the last slide, that Christopher Columbus had anticipated that this would take about 6 weeks to sail west from Europe to arrive in Asia. And because of that, Spain, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, are going to put that amount of supplies on a ship. All right, figure it takes 6 weeks to get there, 6 weeks to get back, 4 weeks to explore. You're talking around 16 to 20 weeks worth of supplies of food on the ship as well, which is important as we get into Columbus's first voyage. Now, during the first voyage, setting sail in August of 1492, Christopher Columbus and his crew very excited at the opportunity for a venture like this, but 6 weeks will quickly pass, and Asia's nowhere in sight, and the crew begins to grow restless. There's no land in sight after 7 weeks, there's no land in sight after 8 weeks, there's no land in sight for over 2.5 months. And for the crew, they're starting to think that maybe Columbus was way off, that maybe he was wrong, that maybe the crew should in fact mutiny. All right, a mutiny is a good word to be familiar with in regards to a crew that overthrows a captain of a ship. All right, and this Columbus's crew in the beginning of October of 1492, they're ready to turn all 3 ships around, but Columbus is persistent. He preaches patience, and although the crew was close to mutinying, on October 11th in 1492, a crew member is going to spot a log floating in the water, and that was the clue that they were getting close to land. And famously, on October 12th of 1492, as Christopher Columbus writes in his journals, he sees land and he has reached Asia. So he was definitely off in his 6-week estimate. It was closer more so to 10, nearly a month more, but that's all out the window. In October of 1492, Columbus has fulfilled his promise of sailing west and reaching Asia. Now, he does believe that he has reached Asia, or as he calls the West Indies, but in fact he's almost 20,000 miles off. Okay, he has reached what is today the Caribbean. And it's noted that Columbus had first stepped foot in what is today the Bahamas, and from there, the three ships will wind up spending most of their time exploring the island of Hispaniola. And today, Hispaniola is an island in the Caribbean. It's divided into two countries. You have Haiti and the Dominican Republic, and this is where Columbus is going to order a settlement to be built for his sailors here. Now, for the next few months, Columbus and his men are going to explore the vast regions of these islands. He will actually explore the southern coast of Cuba. In a journal entry, Columbus believes that the southern coast of Cuba was actually Japan. So, as far as geography is concerned, this guy is way off. Okay, he has no idea what he has stumbled into. And for Columbus, in looking and realizing that there's a tremendous amount of land here to establish Spanish colonies, there's a tremendous opportunity to expand Spanish culture, there is also an opportunity to expand Christianity, because it is during this first voyage that Columbus is introduced to the natives of these islands. And Columbus will note that they are rather friendly at first here, and they are not Christian. And he recognizes that Ferdinand and Isabella, as Catholic monarchs from Spain, would love the opportunity to help spread Christianity to the new lands of the Indies, so to speak. So in January of 1493, Columbus is going to set sail back to Spain. He's going to leave just over 30 men back on the island of Hispaniola to continue to establish a settlement, but also hoping to find goods, specifically gold. And when Columbus returns with the great news, he is a hero. All right, he's truly a hero back in Spain. He tells Ferdinand and Isabella about all that he has found and all that he has discovered, and he truly believes in his heart of hearts that he has in fact found Asia. And because of this, Ferdinand and Isabella, that made a huge gamble on Columbus, this gamble has paid off. And they are willing to finance a second voyage almost immediately. And for Columbus, he is going to be named governor of all of the islands that the Spanish will come across here. He is considered to be a national hero. And one of the caveats of kind of like a contract that Columbus, Ferdinand, and Isabella came up with was that Columbus was going to be able to take 1/10 of all goods and riches found in the Indies. So 1/10 of that, when you consider for Columbus, he's going to be a very wealthy man, and something that he sought out not just to find a quicker trade route to Asia. He has now become famous. Now, during Columbus's lifetime, he is going to make 3 more voyages westward. So after his first original one and now 3 additional ones, Columbus will make a total of 4 voyages, which is, I think, insignificant to know in regards to how many times he crossed the Atlantic within really less than 10 years. Now, for Columbus on his second voyage, aside from being given more supplies, more people are on this time. The second time around, he is given 10 ships instead of 3. He has not only sailors, but this time soldiers. He has Catholic priests in hopes of converting natives to Christianity, and he also has settlers. But one thing happens on his return back to the island of Hispaniola is those 30 sailors that he left behind, they're gone. And there really seems to be no traces of that settlement in May of 1493. And for Columbus, he is going to blame the natives, the inhabitants of these islands, for the disappearance of his crew. And Columbus is quite harsh towards them in regards to that, aside from enslaving many of the natives here in hopes of finding gold, in hopes of building homes, and more importantly, in hopes of having them show Columbus and the Spanish the areas around Hispaniola and the other islands. But we'll get into these natives being slaves a little bit more tomorrow when we look at Columbus as that hero or villain argument that I alluded to earlier. During Columbus's second voyage, he will explore a vast portion of the Caribbean. He winds up on a number of different islands, from Antigua to St. Martin's and even to Puerto Rico. On his third voyage, Columbus will explore head south of the Caribbean. He had heard of a larger landmass in 1498, and that landmass that he believed to have been Asia was actually the northeastern coast of South America. So he gets as far south as South America today. However, it is during his third voyage that violence breaks out on the island of Hispaniola between the Spanish and the natives. And when word gets back to Ferdinand and Isabella about the hostilities, they are going to send a ship over here to arrest Columbus, the governor of Hispaniola, for the sole purpose of there being absolute chaos here on the island. And Columbus, who was a hero nearly 6 years earlier, is now going to be brought back to Spain in chains, in handcuffs as a criminal. Now, after a series of court cases, Columbus will be acquitted of most of the charges. And sadly enough, Columbus basically has to beg for one last voyage from Ferdinand and Isabella. In 1502, Columbus will set sail yet again westward, this time exploring a little bit further west into what is today Central America and the country of Panama. All right. However, he never actually makes it to the Pacific Ocean. After his fourth voyage, Columbus will return to Spain, and this is where he pretty much retires. In 1506, due to a series of diseases, aside from gout, it is believed he had heart failure. In 1506, Columbus will in fact sadly die in Spain. And for Columbus, when we think about his legacy and why we're talking about him here in class, in 1506, Columbus dies not recognizing really his contribution to the age of exploration. For all intents and purposes, in 1506, Columbus dies thinking that he had in fact reached Asia. Unfortunately for Columbus, he didn't reach Asia, but he wound up doing something much far more greater. And when you think about it, the discovery of where Columbus was exploring is going to open up huge opportunities moving forward, and really comes to define the 15 and even the 1600s in Europe, as all countries are going to be intrigued with, well, what exactly lies west from Europe, between Europe and Asia. And in fact, it's a completely different landmass that Europeans were unaware of, and maybe we could argue that that was far more important than establishing a trade route to Asia. So we'll get it back into Christopher Columbus tomorrow in class. As I said, again, I'd like to really split the room and do a hero-villain debate and have you guys go back and forth and trying to establish a legacy for Columbus. But the question now is, well, if Columbus didn't realize that he reached an entirely new landmass, who did? And that's why we have to make mention of now a man by the name of Amerigo Vespucci. Vespucci is a Florentine-born explorer. He was born in Florence, today what would be considered Florence, Italy. So similar to Columbus, he's not technically Italian, but he was from Florence, and he was an explorer who had sailed for and was financed by Portugal and Spain during his lifetime. And on one of his explorations, after reading about what Columbus had discovered and also reading a lot about Asian culture, Amerigo begins to quickly realize that Columbus probably didn't reach Asia, but in fact reached an entirely new landmass. And when Amerigo Vespucci returned back to Europe, he sat down with a German map maker in Europe, and he came up with basically putting land between Europe and Asia to the west, all right smack middle in the Atlantic Ocean. Now, famously, this map maker will refer to the landmass as the Lands of Amerigo, named after Amerigo Vespucci for this proposal and discovery. And over time, the Lands of Amerigo will take on the feminine name in maps and refer to the Lands of America. And that's why we have two continents in the Western Hemisphere named North and South America. All right, notice they're not called North and South Columbia or Columbus because he didn't realize what he really found. It wasn't until Amerigo Vespucci really 10 years after Columbus do we begin to now start to think about, well, maybe he actually did find an entirely new landmass, that in fact this was not Asia. All right, so Vespucci is important because that's really what this continent is named after, good old Amerigo Vespucci. So we'll stop with the notes here. All right, so ideally tomorrow we'll finish section 3. All right. What I'm going to ask that you do now is head into eBackpack. I've sent you guys a homework assignment that I would encourage you guys to start now in the last, I would say, ideally, the last 12 to 15 minutes of class here. If you don't finish these questions in class today, you are responsible for doing that tonight and finishing it up for homework. And I will most certainly be checking these questions upon my return to school tomorrow. So I will actually be around at the end of the day here. If you guys have any questions about today's lesson, I will keep this on my teacher webpage for those of you that weren't able to fill in the blanks for the rest of the week. And again, like I said, it's always important to go home, read over your notes. So if there's anything that you have questions on, feel free to email me, see me at the end of the day, or make a note and we'll bring it up again tomorrow. All right, so please behave for your sub. And again, thank you for your attention. And I'll see you guys tomorrow. Take care.